The cold mud hit her pregnant stomach before she saw his face. That same face that once whispered words of love in a hospital room where their daughter died in her arms. That same face that turned away when she screamed for him to hold their baby just once. That same face now laughing as filthy water soaked through her clothes, freezing against the belly where a miracle she was told would never happen was growing. She stood there 5 months pregnant, drenched in muddy water outside a regular grocery store, and watched her ex-husband lean out of his expensive car with disgust twisting his features. He mocked her for shopping at a budget store like some desperate, pathetic woman who couldn't afford better. His eyes dropped to her rounded stomach, and the contempt in his gaze cut deeper than any knife could have. He laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in her ears, and asked whoever had been foolish enough to get her pregnant if they knew what they were dealing with. Then came the words that made her blood freeze. He reminded her, loud enough for strangers to hear, that her body couldn't carry a child, that she would kill this one too, just like she killed theirs. Her hands shook as muddy water dripped down her face, mixing with tears she refused to let him see. The groceries she'd been carrying lay scattered on the wet pavement, ruined and forgot. Her mind flashed back to that hospital room where she lost everything while he chose a business meeting over holding her hand. To the divorce papers where he told everyone she was a cheater who destroyed their marriage. To the doctors who said the trauma had left her unable to have children. But he had no idea that the woman he just humiliated on a public street was now married to a billionaire's son who controlled the £12 billion empire that held every contract keeping his business alive. He had no idea that in 3 weeks, when her new father-in-law announced on live television that she was pregnant with his heir, her ex-husband wouldn't just lose his empire. He would be destroyed on national television while the world watched. This moment, this humiliation, this cruelty, it was the beginning of the end for him. But the story of how she got here, standing in muddy water carrying a miracle baby while her abuser drove away laughing, that story started 6 years earlier with a choice that would cost her everything she thought love was supposed to be. She was 22 years old, standing in a registry office wearing a simple white dress her mother had sewn by hand, watching a confident magnetic man slide a gold ring onto her finger. He whispered that she was his now, and she thought it sounded romantic, like something out of a movie. She didn't know yet that he meant it like ownership, like she was another property he'd acquired, another asset in his growing portfolio. He was building an empire of luxury properties across the city, developing high-end apartments and commercial spaces that made him a small fortune before he turned 30. She taught young students at a primary school, made a modest salary, and came home every evening to a man who was becoming a king in his own mind. The first year was beautiful in the way fairy tales are beautiful before you realize they're actually warnings. He bought her designer dresses she never asked for, expensive perfume that made her feel like someone else, jewelry that felt too heavy on her skin like chains disguised as gifts. He took her to restaurants where she didn't recognize half the words on the menu and made her feel small when she asked what they meant. But she told herself this was love, that he was elevating her, giving her a life she never could have built on her own. By the second year, the cracks started showing through the expensive veneer. He began commenting on her clothes, telling her that what she chose wasn't appropriate for someone in his position. He started controlling what she wore, scheduling her hair appointments without asking, making decisions about her body like it belonged to him. She told herself it was love, that he just wanted her to fit into his world, that compromise was part of marriage. Hey my people, if you're feeling this story so far, do me a favor and drop a like on this video. Comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from, because this community is growing and I love seeing you all here. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to join this storytelling family, because what happens next in this woman's life will blow your mind. Now let's get back to her story, because the third year of her marriage was when everything she thought she knew about love came crashing down. The third year she got pregnant. She cried happy tears when she saw the positive test, imagining a little girl with his dark hair and her green eyes, a child who would be loved and protected and cherished. He seemed excited too at first, telling his business partners like it was an achievement, like he'd closed another successful deal. But then the pregnancy became inconvenient for his lifestyle and his image. She had morning sickness that lasted all day, couldn't attend his business events where he needed her to smile and look perfect on his arm. He grew frustrated, demanding she push through it, telling her other women managed just fine. At 6 months pregnant, she was at school reading to her students when she felt the cramping. Sharp, violent, wrong in every way a sensation can be wrong. She called him 17 times while pain ripped through her body. He was in a meeting closing a massive deal and every call went to voicemail. A parent at the school drove her to the hospital because the man who promised to love and protect her couldn't be bothered to answer his phone. The doctors tried everything, but her baby was born silent. perfectly formed with tiny fingers and delicate features and eyes that would never open, gone before she ever got to hear her cry. She held her daughter's tiny body, screaming for him to come to see her, to hold their baby just once before they took her away forever. He arrived 8 hours later, still in his suit, smelling like whiskey and success. He stood uncomfortable at the foot of the hospital bed, checking his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. He said these things happened that they could try again, like he was discussing a failed property inspection instead of the death of their child. Then came worse news that would change everything. The doctor explained there were complications from the stress and trauma of the loss. Her chances of carrying another pregnancy to term were extremely low, damaged by grief and physical trauma. She was 26 years old, lying in a hospital bed still bleeding, being told her body was broken and might never work the way it was supposed to. When she finally found the courage to tell her husband, his response was 5 cold words that would haunt her for years. "So you're basically barren now." Not sympathy, not comfort, not even false reassurance. Just that word barren, like she was dead soil, worthless land, a failed investment that had disappointed him. And in that moment, something inside her began to die too, something that wouldn't come back to life for a very long time. Would he use this tragedy as a weapon against her for the rest of their marriage? Would the woman who just lost everything find a way to survive the man who was supposed to love her? The answer would break her before it could ever make her whole again. From that moment in the hospital, he used that word like a weapon designed specifically to destroy her. Barren. He wielded it at dinner parties when friends and business partners innocently asked about children, and he would glance at her with that look, that mixture of pity and disgust, before saying something vague about complications. During arguments when he needed to wound her in the place that hurt most, he would remind her that she couldn't give him the one thing that mattered, that she was fundamentally broken as a woman. He used it to justify his affairs when she discovered lipstick on his collars and perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his expensive suits. The first time she found evidence of his cheating, she confronted him with a text message she'd seen on his phone, her hands shaking as she held the proof of his betrayal. He didn't even try to deny it or apologize. Instead, he turned it around on her with such casual cruelty that it took her breath away. He told her that maybe if she were more exciting, more fun to be around, more capable of giving him an air like a proper wife should, he wouldn't need to look elsewhere for what she couldn't provide. She spent 3 years as a ghost in her own marriage, haunting rooms that used to feel like home but now felt like a museum of everything she'd lost. Therapy twice a week with a kind woman who kept asking her why she stayed, and she never had a good answer beyond the fact that she believed she deserved this somehow. Medication for depression that made everything feel distant and muted, but at least stopped the worst of the darkness from swallowing her whole. Teaching during the day, pouring all her love into other people's children because she would never have her own. Then coming home to a man who looked at her like she'd failed him in the most fundamental way a wife could fail. His affairs became obvious to everyone who knew them. She would see the knowing looks from his business associates' wives at company events, the way conversation would stop when she entered a room, the whispered pity that followed her like a shadow. Everyone knew what he was doing and everyone knew she was staying anyway, which somehow made it worse. She stayed because some broken part of her believed he was right, that she was damaged goods, that no other man would want a woman who couldn't give him children. Until the night she came home early from a school event that ended sooner than expected and found him in their bed with another woman. Both naked, both laughing about something tangled in sheets she had washed that morning. He didn't even look ashamed when he saw her standing in the doorway. He didn't scramble to cover himself or make excuses. He just looked annoyed that she'd interrupted, like she was an unwelcome guest in her own home. He told her maybe if she were more exciting, more of a real woman instead of a broken shell, he wouldn't need to find comfort in other arms. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather instead of destroying what was left of their marriage. She packed a bag that night while he showered like nothing had happened, throwing clothes into a suitcase without caring what she grabbed, just needing to get out before she suffocated on the toxic air in that house. She filed for divorce the next morning, sitting in a lawyer's office with red eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, finally choosing herself even though she didn't quite believe she was worth choosing. But he didn't let her go quietly because men like him never do. He told everyone who would listen that she was the one who cheated, that she was unstable and broken and couldn't be trusted. He painted himself as the victim of a mentally ill wife who had destroyed their marriage through her own failures, and he was so convincing that people believed him. Friends she'd known for years stopped calling. His family, who had welcomed her warmly before the pregnancy loss, now looked at her with suspicion and disappointment. He took the narrative of their marriage and rewrote it with himself as the hero and her as the villain, and she was too exhausted to fight him. For 11 months after the divorce was finalized, she believed the story he told about her. She lived in a tiny flat that cost half her teaching salary, with second-hand furniture and walls so thin she could hear her neighbors' conversations. She taught full-time, went to therapy every week, and tried to remember who she used to be before she became someone's broken wife. Hey fam, if this story is hitting you in the feels, show some love by dropping a like and subscribing to the channel. Comment below and tell me if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone tried to destroy you, because your stories matter and this community is all about lifting each other up. Now let's get back to this woman's journey, because someone was about to walk into her life and change everything she thought she knew about love and worth. She was living that quiet, small life when a friend from work dragged her to a charity event for children's literacy. She almost said no because charity events meant wealthy people, and wealthy people reminded her of her ex-husband and everything she was trying to forget. But something made her agree, maybe loneliness or maybe just the fact that she was tired of saying no to life. She wore a simple navy dress, the first dress she'd bought for herself in years. No one chose it for her based on whether it made her look appropriate or successful or worthy. No one told her it wasn't good enough or didn't fit the image she should project. It was hers, and that felt like a small act of rebellion. At the event, she felt immediately out of place among the elegant crowd in their designer gowns and expensive jewelry. Women who looked like they'd never packed their own suitcase at midnight or cried themselves to sleep on a bare mattress because they'd left everything behind. She was about to leave, to slip out quietly before anyone noticed she didn't belong, when she saw a man in a plain dark suit setting up chairs near the back of the venue. He wasn't barking orders at staff or checking his phone every 30 seconds or making sure important people saw him doing charity work. He was just helping. Quietly arranging chairs so people would have somewhere to sit, and there was something genuine about it that made her pause. She offered to help because it gave her something to do besides stand awkwardly by the refreshment table. They spent 2 hours talking while they worked, conversations that flowed easily about books and teaching and the magic of watching a child read their first sentence and understand that those marks on a page held entire worlds. He listened like her words actually mattered, like her thoughts were valuable, like she was someone worth paying attention to. Not because of who she was married to or how much money she made or whether her body worked properly, just because of who she was. They met for coffee 3 days later, then dinner the following week, then long walks through the park where they talked about everything and nothing. He talked about working in family business operations but never elaborated on what that meant, and she didn't care because he wasn't the job or the money or the status. He was kind and patient and never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. When she finally told him about her divorce, about losing her baby, about being told she was barren and believing for years that it made her worthless, he held her hand across the cafe table and said nothing. Because nothing needed to be said, and sometimes silence is the kindest response to pain that has no easy answers. 4 months into dating, he took her to meet his father at a family dinner. He confessed his last name in the car on the way there, and when she heard it, she recognized it immediately because everyone in the country knew that name. His father was one of the most powerful billionaires in the nation, the owner of a £12 billion empire that touched everything from real estate to telecommunications to banking. She was shocked he hadn't told her sooner, felt almost betrayed that he'd kept something so significant hidden. But he explained gently that he wanted her to know him first, not his last name, not his father's money, not the weight of expectations that came with being born into that kind of wealth and power. She thought about her ex-husband, who had led with his wealth and status and success, who had made sure she knew from day one that she should feel grateful he'd chosen her. Then she looked at this man who'd spent 4 months helping her arrange chairs and talking about children's books and holding her when she cried, who had loved her without needing her to be anything other than herself. Would this new relationship survive the weight of his family's expectations? Would she finally find the love and acceptance she'd been denied for so long? The answer would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. It didn't change anything. That's what she told him when the shock wore off and she could breathe again after learning his father controlled billions. The money, the power, the empire, none of it mattered because he had already shown her who he was in the quiet moments when no one was watching. He had already proven his worth in coffee shops and park benches and conversations about books instead of business deals. They were engaged 3 months later, and the proposal wasn't some grand public spectacle designed to impress people or generate social media attention. It was just the two of them on the same park bench where they'd had their first real conversation, and he asked her with tears in his eyes if she would let him spend the rest of his life proving that she was worthy of real love. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a private garden with only family and close friends who actually mattered to them. Her new father-in-law insisted on walking her down the aisle since her own father had passed away when she was 19, and she cried when he took her arm because she hadn't expected that kind of tenderness from a man who commanded boardrooms and controlled empires. He told her she was his daughter now, not just a daughter-in-law who happened to marry his son, but his daughter in every way that mattered, his daughter. Her ex-husband never knew the wedding happened because she had moved on so completely that he no longer existed in her world. She didn't send announcements or post photos or feel any need to prove to him that someone else had seen her value. She was simply happy, genuinely happy for the first time in years, and that was enough. 3 months into the marriage, she felt nauseous during a morning assembly at school. The familiar sensation made her freeze in the middle of helping a 6-year-old with her reading, because she knew that feeling, had felt it before 6 years ago when everything was still possible and hope hadn't yet turned to grief. She took a pregnancy test she'd been carrying in her purse for a week, too terrified to use it because she couldn't survive the disappointment of another negative result. 2 lines appeared, positive, clear and undeniable and impossible. She slid down the bathroom wall in the staff restroom and cried, but not from joy, not yet. From absolute terror that felt like it was crushing her chest and making it hard to breathe. Because the doctors had said this would never happen, had told her the damage was too severe and her chances were so low that she should accept she would never carry a pregnancy to term. Because she still heard her ex-husband's voice in her head telling her she would kill any baby she carried, that her body was broken and useless and fundamentally wrong. She called her new husband with shaking hands, barely able to get the words out through her panic and tears. He arrived at the school within 20 minutes even though his office was across the city, and he knelt on the bathroom floor in his expensive suit without caring about the tile or the germs or anything except her. He took her face in his hands and promised they would do this together, every appointment, every moment of fear, every doubt that tried to steal her joy. She wasn't alone anymore, and he would make sure she never forgot that. At 4 months, the doctors confirmed the pregnancy was healthy and stable, and nothing short of miraculous given her medical history. They kept using that word miracle, and she started to believe it might be true. At 5 months, her bump started showing in a way she couldn't hide anymore, and her young students made her cards covered in glitter and misspelled congratulations that she kept in a folder and cried over every night. Her father-in-law was beside himself with joy when they told him at a family dinner. He toasted her with tears streaming down his face and said she'd given the family something they didn't know they were missing. Not an heir to his empire, not a legacy to carry on his name, but hope that good things could still happen to good people who'd suffered more than their share of pain. She was 5 months pregnant when she decided to visit her old neighborhood for the first time since the divorce, feeling nostalgic and wanting to see if the little cafe where she used to grade papers was still there. She stopped at the grocery store for some pregnancy cravings, pickles and ice cream and other ridiculous combinations that made her laugh at herself. She wore comfortable maternity clothes that prioritized her comfort over her appearance, her hair was messy from the wind, and she'd left her security detail at home for once because she just wanted to feel normal for an afternoon. That's when he saw her. That's when her ex-husband, driving his expensive car through the neighborhood he'd long since moved away from, recognized the woman he'd once called barren standing outside a budget grocery store. Hey my people, before we continue with what happens next, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. Drop a comment and let me know if you believe in karma because what's coming is the definition of justice. And subscribe to join this family because you don't want to miss how this unfolds. Now let's get back to that parking lot because her nightmare was just beginning. He accelerated his expensive car deliberately toward a massive puddle beside where she was standing. The impact was violent and intentional, a tsunami of muddy water that exploded over her body with such force it knocked her back a step. The cold, filthy water soaked her face, drenched her hair, plastered her maternity clothes to her pregnant belly, and destroyed the groceries she'd been holding. He stopped the car and leaned out the window, and she saw his face clearly for the first time in almost 2 years. That face that once promised to love her forever, now twisted with pure contempt and something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction at her humiliation. His new girlfriend sat beside him in the passenger seat, younger and perfectly made up, giggling like this was the funniest thing she'd ever witnessed. He mocked her for still shopping at budget stores like some desperate, pathetic woman who couldn't afford better. He asked if this was really what her life had become, standing outside cheap grocery stores looking like a mess. Then his eyes dropped to her rounded stomach, visible even through her soaked clothes, and the contempt in his gaze intensified into something cruel and vicious. He laughed, a sound that made her feel sick, and called out loud enough for other shoppers to hear that whoever had been foolish enough to get her pregnant clearly didn't know what they were dealing with. He reminded her, with an audience of strangers watching in shock, that her useless body couldn't carry a child to term, that she would kill this one too, just like she killed theirs, because that's what broken women do. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing exactly where he intended, on the scars that had never fully healed. Her hands instinctively went to her belly, protective and terrified, while muddy water dripped down her face and mixed with tears she couldn't hold back anymore. Someone was filming on their phone, capturing every second of her humiliation, but she didn't even notice because all she could hear was his voice telling her she was a murder of Bobby's. He sped off with his girlfriend still laughing, leaving her standing in filthy water with destroyed groceries scattered around her feet and dignity shattered into pieces. Other shoppers rushed over to help her, offering tissues and kind words and outraged commentary about what they'd just witnessed, but she barely heard them through the ringing in her ears. Someone had filmed it. Someone had captured the entire encounter on their phone, from the deliberate splashing to his cruel words to her tears. Within hours, that video was uploaded to social media with a caption about a man publicly humiliating his pregnant ex-wife. Within hours, it started spreading across platforms, shared by people who were outraged by what they were seeing. 15 million views in the first day. Then someone, a person who'd attended one of the family's charity events, recognized her from a photo where she stood beside her new husband and father-in-law. They commented on the video, identifying her as the billionaire's daughter-in-law, and that single comment changed everything. The story exploded across every news outlet in the country. Headlines screamed about the man who humiliated a pregnant woman without knowing she was married into one of the most powerful families in the nation. Social media erupted with outrage and calls for justice. Journalists started digging into her ex-husband's business, his contracts, his connections. And her father-in-law, the man who'd walked her down the aisle and called her his daughter, he saw the video. He watched a man publicly humiliate and threaten his pregnant daughter-in-law. He watched someone try to destroy the woman his son loved and the grandchild she was carrying. Within 48 hours, her ex-husband's world began to collapse. His government contracts, worth millions and the backbone of his company, were frozen pending review of his character and fitness to represent public interests. 3 major banks called in £60 million in loans, citing reputation concerns and moral clauses in their agreements. His stock price crashed as investors panicked and sold off their shares. His board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted him out as CEO of his own company. Would her ex-husband understand what he'd done? Would he realize that the woman he tried to destroy had become untouchable? The real reckoning was still 3 weeks away, and it would happen on national television for the entire country to witness. Her ex-husband didn't understand what was happening at first. He sat in his office 2 days after the incident, scrolling through news articles about himself with growing confusion and then panic. The video had been viewed by millions, shared across every platform, dissected by journalists and commentators who universally condemned his actions. But it was the financial consequences that truly terrified him, the way his entire empire was crumbling in real time while he watched helplessly. His assistant knocked on his door with another resignation letter, the 5th one that day. Key employees were abandoning ship before it fully sank, updating their resumes and taking meetings with competitors who suddenly found them very attractive candidates. His phone rang constantly with lawyers, accountants, board members, all delivering worse news than the last call. The banks wanted their money immediately, not in installments or through negotiations, but now. And he didn't have £60 million liquid because everything was tied up in properties and investments that were now plummeting in value. His girlfriend, the one who'd laughed beside him in the car, left him that same week. She packed her designer bags that he'd bought her and moved in with a friend, telling him through text that she couldn't be associated with someone so publicly despised. She didn't even have the courage to say it to his face, just sent a cold message and blocked his number like he was a stranger instead of someone she'd shared a bed with for 8 months. The government contracts that had been the foundation of his business for 5 years were terminated, not just frozen but completely canceled with penalties attached. Someone high up had made a decision that a man who would publicly humiliate and threaten a pregnant woman was not fit to represent public interests or handle taxpayer money. The official letters cited moral turpitude and breach of public trust, legal language that basically meant they found him disgusting and wanted nothing to do with him. His company's stock became worthless within a week. Investors sold off their shares in a panic, and the price dropped from £42 per share to less than £3. The company he'd built over 15 years, that had been worth nearly £50 million at its peak, was now a shell that couldn't pay its debts or meet its obligations. His board of directors, men who'd once praised his vision and leadership, voted unanimously to remove him as CEO and install an interim leader to try to salvage what was left. But the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night staring at his ceiling in disbelief, was that he still didn't know who she'd married. The news articles mentioned she was the daughter-in-law of a prominent billionaire family but didn't name them specifically, and he couldn't figure out which family had the power to destroy him this thoroughly and this quickly. He made calls to contacts who used to answer immediately but now let him go to voicemail. He tried to find out through social media and public records, but her profiles were private and her marriage license didn't appear in any databases he could access. 3 weeks after the incident, an invitation arrived at his apartment. Heavy cardstock formal calligraphy, the kind of invitation that couldn't be ignored even if he wanted to. It was for a charity gala benefiting children's literacy programs, hosted by one of the country's most powerful families and broadcast live on national television. He almost threw it away, because he couldn't imagine why he'd been invited to something so high-profile when his reputation was in tatters. Then he saw the note attached, handwritten in elegant script. It suggested his attendance would be in his best interest, that answers he'd been seeking would be provided. It was signed with initials he didn't recognize but somehow felt ominous, like a summons from a judge rather than an invitation to a party. He went because he had nothing left to lose and because some part of him hoped this was an opportunity to rebuild connections, to remind powerful people that he still existed and deserved a second chance. He wore his best remaining suit, the one he hadn't sold yet to pay lawyers, and arrived at the venue with his stomach in knots. The ballroom was filled with 200 of the country's most powerful people, titans of industry and politics and finance who moved in circles he'd once aspired to join. Cameras were positioned around the room for the live broadcast, and a stage was set up at the front with microphones and elegant lighting. He found a seat near the back, trying to be invisible among people who wouldn't make eye contact with him or acknowledge his presence. "Hey fam, I need you to pause and really focus on what's about to happen next, because this is the moment we've been building toward. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling me if you think he deserves what's coming, and subscribe because this channel is all about stories where justice actually wins. Now let's get back to that ballroom because the truth was about to destroy him in front of 8 million viewers." The charity program began with speeches from various donors and organizers, people talking about the importance of literacy and education. He barely paid attention, too busy scanning the room and wondering why he'd been invited. Then the host announced that the evening's patron and largest donor would say a few words, and an older man walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He recognized the face immediately. Everyone in the country would recognize that face. It was the patriarch of the family that controlled £12 billion in assets, the man whose business empire touched everything from telecommunications to banking to real estate. The man whose contracts and financial backing could make or break entire industries. The billionaire spoke about family and legacy and the importance of protecting the people we love. His voice was warm but carried an edge that made the room fall completely silent. Then he gestured to the side of the stage and two people walked out to join him under the lights. A man in an elegant dark suit, clearly the billionaire's son based on the resemblance, and beside him a woman in an emerald gown that showed her 6-month pregnant belly. Her hair was styled perfectly, her makeup flawless, and she glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from being completely loved and protected. He felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized her. His ex-wife. The woman he'd called barren and worthless. The woman he'd humiliated 3 weeks ago in a grocery store parking lot, standing on stage beside the heir to a £12 billion empire, carrying a child that proved every cruel word he'd ever said to her was a lie. The patriarch placed his hand gently on her shoulder and announced to the room, and to the 8 million people watching on television that his daughter-in-law was carrying his first grandchild. He said the word daughter-in-law with such emphasis and pride that it was clear he considered her family in every way that mattered, not just through marriage but through genuine love and respect. Then the billionaire's tone changed, became harder and colder, and he made it clear without naming names that anyone who disrespected his family, anyone who threatened or humiliated those he loved, would face the full consequences of their actions. He said that protecting family wasn't just a personal value but a business principle, and that his empire had no room for cruelty or those who enabled it. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he meant. The story had been in every newspaper, on every news channel, dissected in every social media post for 3 weeks. They all knew about the man who'd splashed mud on a pregnant woman and mocked her for being barren. He sat frozen in his seat at the back of the ballroom, watching his ex-wife stand in a room filled with the most powerful people in the country, radiant and protected and loved in ways he'd never loved her. The cameras captured every moment, broadcasting it live to millions of viewers who were probably cheering at their screens. His phone started buzzing in his pocket with messages and calls, but he couldn't move to check them. He could only stare at the stage, at the life she'd built without him, at the family who'd embraced her while his own world crumbled into nothing. The gala continued around him with dinner and dancing and networking, but he sat paralyzed while people avoided his section of the room like he carried a contagious disease. When he finally checked his phone hours later, he found messages from his lawyer saying the last of his contracts had been terminated, from his accountant saying bankruptcy was now inevitable, from his mother asking if what she'd seen on television was true. 3 months later, he signed papers selling what remained of his company for a fraction of its former value, just enough to pay off the most pressing debts and avoid complete financial ruin. The luxury apartment he'd owned was sold to cover bank loans. His expensive car was repossessed. The investment properties that had made him wealthy were liquidated at losses that made him physically ill. He moved into a small flat in a neighborhood he would have sneered at during his successful years, with furniture from discount stores and walls so thin he could hear his neighbors arguing about bills. He took a job as a consultant for a modest salary, advising other companies on mistakes to avoid, though he never mentioned that his biggest mistake was treating a good woman like she was worthless. Meanwhile, she became one of the country's most beloved public figures. Photographers captured her at charity events glowing with pregnancy and genuine joy. Articles praised her grace and her husband's devotion, and the family's commitment to treating her as true family rather than just a daughter-in-law. When her baby was born healthy and perfect, the announcement made national news and social media erupted with celebration. He saw the photos online, saw her holding her daughter with her husband beside her and her father-in-law beaming with pride. He saw everything he'd told her would never happen, happening for someone who'd valued her enough to deserve her. But was this truly the end of the story? Had justice been completely served, or was there more lurking beneath the surface? Because while she'd found happiness and he'd lost everything, there were still questions that hadn't been answered and wounds that hadn't fully healed. And sometimes the most dangerous moments come when you think the battle is finally over. She stood in the nursery 6 months after her daughter was born, watching morning light filter through soft curtains onto the crib where her miracle baby slept peacefully. Her daughter had her father's dark hair and her green eyes, just like she'd once imagined years ago in a different life with a different man. But this baby was real and healthy and loved by so many people that sometimes it overwhelmed her with gratitude. Her husband came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched their daughter sleep. These quiet moments were her favorite, when the world outside with all its expectations and public attention didn't exist, and it was just the three of them in their own bubble of happiness. But happiness, she was learning, doesn't erase the past, it just gives you the strength to finally face it. The therapy sessions she'd continued throughout her pregnancy, and after the birth had helped her understand that healing isn't linear and justice doesn't always bring closure. Her therapist kept asking her the same question in different ways, trying to get her to confront something she'd been avoiding. Did she feel satisfied with how things turned out? Did watching her ex-husband lose everything actually make her feel better, or did it just create a different kind of emptiness? The truth was complicated in ways she didn't like admitting. Yes, there was satisfaction in knowing he'd faced consequences for his cruelty, that the universe had balanced the scales in a way that felt almost biblical. But there was also something unfinished, something that kept her awake some nights even with her perfect daughter sleeping down the hall and her loving husband beside her. She'd never confronted him directly, never looked him in the eye and told him how much damage he'd caused, how many years of her life he'd stolen with his cruelty and manipulation. The viral video and the gala announcement had been public humiliation, but they hadn't been personal reckoning. He'd lost his empire, but had he actually understood why? Had he learned anything, or was he just a victim of circumstances in his own mind, blaming everyone but himself for his downfall? Her father-in-law had asked her recently, during a quiet family dinner, if she felt the matter was resolved. He'd said it gently without judgment, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He was protective of her in ways that made her want to cry sometimes, this powerful man who'd embraced her as his daughter and defended her so fiercely. But he also understood that real healing sometimes required confrontation, rather than just consequences delivered from a distance. She hadn't answered him that night, just smiled and changed the subject to her daughter's first attempts at rolling over. But the question stayed with her, growing louder in her mind with each passing day. 3 weeks after that dinner, she received a letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to her home by regular mail. The return address was from a part of the city she hadn't visited in years, the kind of neighborhood where her ex-husband would have never imagined living during his successful years. She stared at the envelope for an hour before opening it, her hands shaking with emotions she couldn't quite name. Anger, curiosity, fear, something that felt almost like grief for the girl she used to be who'd loved him once before everything turned dark and cruel. Hey my people, before we go any further, I need you to understand that what happens next is going to change everything. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what you think is in that letter, and make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from over. Now let's see what her ex-husband had to say after losing everything. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in the same script she remembered from birthday cards and anniversary notes back when he still pretended to be a man who loved her. The words were careful and measured, clearly written and rewritten multiple times based on the way some phrases were slightly different in ink darkness, like he'd paused and thought hard about what he wanted to say. He didn't apologize. That was the first thing she noticed, reading through the pages with increasing tension in her chest. He explained his circumstances, described his small, flat and modest job and lonely existence, but he never said he was sorry for the years of abuse or the cruel words or the public humiliation. Instead, he wrote about perspective and consequences and how life had taught him harsh lessons about power and hubris. He said he understood now that she'd moved on to a better life, that she'd found the family and love he'd been incapable of giving her. He acknowledged that his behavior at the grocery store had been the catalyst for his downfall, though he phrased it like an unfortunate incident rather than a deliberate act of cruelty. He mentioned seeing photos of her daughter online, and said he was glad the doctors had been wrong about her ability to carry a pregnancy, like he deserved credit for caring about her happiness. But it was the last paragraph that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart start racing with something between rage and disbelief. He wrote that he'd been thinking about their daughter, the one they'd lost together, and wondered if she ever thought about what their life might have been if that baby had lived. He said he regretted not holding their daughter when she was born, that it was the one thing from their marriage he wished he could change. And that he hoped someday they might be able to talk about it because he was the only other person in the world who'd lost that specific child. He ended the letter by saying he wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, just acknowledgement that their shared history existed and that perhaps someday, when enough time had passed, they could have a conversation about the people they used to be and the child they'd lost together. She read the letter 3 times, and each time her emotions shifted and changed like a kaleidoscope. The first reading made her angry at his presumption that he had any right to contact her. The second reading made her sad for everyone involved, for the broken people they'd been and the tragedy that had started everything. The third reading made her notice what he'd carefully avoided saying, the apologies he'd deliberately omitted, the accountability he still refused to accept. She showed the letter to her husband that evening after putting their daughter to bed. He read it silently, his expression growing darker with each paragraph, and when he finished he asked her a simple question. What did she want to do about this? That was the question, wasn't it? Because this letter changed things in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her ex-husband wasn't just a villain who'd been defeated and banished from her story. He was a real person who'd lost a child too, who carried his own trauma even if he'd weaponized hers, and who was now reaching out across the destruction of both their former lives to suggest they had unfinished business. Her therapist would probably say this was an opportunity for closure, for the kind of honest conversation that could help her fully move forward. Her father-in-law would probably advise caution, remind her that she owed this man nothing and that reopening old wounds could be dangerous for her mental health and her family's peace. But what did she want? Did she want to ignore the letter and continue building her new life as if he didn't exist? Did she want to respond with her own carefully worded message setting boundaries and explaining why contact was inappropriate? Or did she want to meet him face to face and finally say all the things she'd never gotten to say when he was destroying her, when she was too broken to fight back, when she believed the story he told about her being worthless? She sat with the letter in her lap long after her husband went to bed, staring at her ex-husband's handwriting and thinking about the girl she used to be. The girl who'd stood in a registry office wearing a white dress her mother made, who believed in love and marriage and happily ever after. The girl who'd held her dying daughter and screamed for a man who never came. The girl who'd packed a bag at midnight and filed for divorce the next morning because staying meant dying inside. That girl deserved something this letter didn't give her. That girl deserved an apology and accountability and acknowledgement that what happened to her was abuse, not just unfortunate circumstances or harsh lessons about life. But did confronting him now from a position of power and happiness and security give her what that girl needed, or would it just reopen wounds that had finally started to heal? Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost didn't check it, thinking it was spam or a wrong number, but something made her look at the screen. The message was short, just 2 sentences that made her blood run cold and her heart start pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. I saw you received my letter. We need to talk before I have to make some difficult decisions about what I'm going to tell people about the real reason our daughter died. She stared at the message as her hands started shaking, as rage and fear and disbelief flooded through her system in waves. He wasn't reaching out for closure or healing or shared grief. He was threatening her, suggesting he had information or a story that could damage her reputation or her family or the life she'd built. After everything he'd lost, after being destroyed publicly and financially and socially, he was still trying to hurt her, still trying to control her through fear and manipulation and the trauma of their shared past. Her husband appeared in the doorway, alerted by something in her posture or her breathing, and asked what was wrong. She showed him the message, watched his face transform from concern to fury as he read the thinly veiled threat. He reached for his phone to call his father, to activate the full power of the family's legal team and resources to shut down whatever her ex-husband was planning. But she stopped him with a hand on his arm, her mind suddenly clear and focused in a way it hadn't been since she'd opened that letter. Because she realized in that moment that this wasn't over. The public humiliation and financial ruin hadn't been enough to stop him from being the same man who'd abused her for years. He'd just found a new weapon, a new way to try to control her, and he was testing to see if she was still the broken woman he remembered or if she'd truly become someone different. What was he threatening to reveal? What lie was he planning to tell about their daughter's death? And more importantly, what was she willing to do to protect her family and her peace from a man who refused to let her go? The battle she thought was over had just begun again, but this time she had something she'd never had before. Power, protection, and the absolute certainty that she deserved better than anything this man had ever given her. But would that be enough when he was willing to weaponize their dead daughter's memory to hurt her one more time? The answer would require a confrontation she'd spent years avoiding, a reckoning that would force both of them to face the truth about who they really were and what they'd done to each other. And somewhere in that truth lay secrets that could destroy everything she'd built or finally set her free. The choice was hers to make, but the clock was ticking, and her ex-husband was waiting for her response with whatever twisted plan he devised in his small flat while watching her happiness from a distance. What happened next would determine not just her future, but her daughter's understanding of the mother she would grow up to know, and whether the past could ever truly be buried or if it would always find a way to claw its way back to the surface demanding attention.